What if a $500 fine for wearing a cross didn't silence a young woman, but lit a fire across the nation? When 27-year-old Karoline Leavitt walked into a D.C. courtroom, no one expected a religious freedom showdown, or that she'd school the judge with the Constitution itself. From court battles and media takedowns to standing beside veterans and pastors, her journey becomes a living reminder of what America once stood for and still can. If you believe truth, faith, and courage don't go out of style, stay with us. Because this isn't just a story, it's a movement, 50 years in the making. They say Washington, D.C. is full of surprises, but no one in that cramped local courthouse expected this one. It was a warm afternoon when 27-year-old Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in American history, walked into the D.C. Municipal Court, wearing a simple navy blazer with a silver cross pinned near her collar. She wasn't there to cause a stir, just to quietly observe a local religious freedom case as instructed by President Trump. But within minutes, what should have been a routine hearing turned into a courtroom showdown that would shake the justice system and spark a nationwide conversation. The judge on the bench, Charles Quinn, 62, had seen hundreds of faces walk through his courtroom doors. But when he noticed Karoline's cross, everything changed. Ignoring others in the room who wore flashy jewelry and offensive T-shirts, Judge Quinn zeroed in on her modest symbol of faith. His voice was sharp. His decision, a $500 fine for contempt of court. The courtroom gasped. Some whispered, others shook their heads. Even the court clerk paused her typing, unsure how to react. But Karoline remained calm. While most would have apologized or backed down, she stood her ground, not with anger, but with knowledge. And that's when everything flipped. In a voice calm and clear, Karoline quoted the First Amendment and cited a major Supreme Court ruling. Church of Lukumi Babalu I, Virtus City of Hialeah, 1893, which protected religious expression. Then she pointed out the hypocrisy around the room. One man wore a graphic T-shirt, another woman's necklace sparkled like a chandelier. But no one else was fined. Just her, and just for being Christian. By then, she had already discreetly recorded everything and alerted the White House. What followed was a breathtaking display of legal brilliance. Karoline revealed case precedent, presented data, and demanded accountability. Within hours, her story exploded on social media. The hashtag #CrossInCourt trended nationwide. Calls flooded city offices. Reporters raced to the scene. And by the next day, Judge Quinn was under investigation for religious bias. For many Americans, especially those who cherish faith and fairness, this wasn't just a moment. It was a message: you're never too young to stand up for your rights, and you're never too old to be reminded of what our Constitution protects. Karoline didn't walk into court that day to start a revolution. But when she was pushed, she didn't just push back, she pushed for change. And thanks to her boldness, that $500 fine became something far more powerful. A framed symbol of resilience now hanging in her White House office. If you believe in truth, justice, and the power of standing up no matter your age, you won't want to miss what happens next. Most people in America had already heard the now famous story of the bold young woman who stood tall in a D.C. courtroom, fined $500 just for wearing a cross, only to leave the judge speechless with her legal mastery. That woman was Karoline Leavitt, 27-year-old White House press secretary who turned a symbol of faith into a nationwide movement for religious freedom. But just when America thought they had seen the extent of Karoline's courage, a second courtroom encounter revealed something even deeper: her unwavering dedication to the truth, even when the entire system seemed stacked against her. It all began just 2 weeks after the cross-in-court incident. Karoline was once again called upon, not by the president this time, but by her own sense of duty. A powerful media corporation, Global News Bureau, had filed a defamation lawsuit against her, claiming she had falsely criticized them during a live press conference. The suit wasn't just an attack on Karoline, it was an attack on the administration, on free speech, and perhaps most importantly on truth itself. Unlike her last appearance, this time she wasn't just observing, she was the defendant. When she walked into the courtroom that morning, the air was thick with anticipation. Reporters lined the hallway. Legal analysts whispered predictions. And seated at the bench was Judge Margaret Holloway, a veteran with over 30 years on the bench and a reputation for no-nonsense rulings. As Karoline took her seat without an attorney at her side, some in the gallery smirked. Holloway herself let out a faint chuckle. A young woman standing alone against one of the most powerful media companies in the country, representing herself. Surely, this was going to be a short trial. And for the first few hours, it looked like the doubters were right. Karoline fumbled her notes, lost her place, and even dropped a sheet of paper at one point. The media's lawyers smirked. The judge seemed impatient. Whispers fluttered around the room like autumn leaves. But what no one realized, what even the judge missed, was that Karoline was laying a trap. She wasn't flustered. She was listening. She wasn't unprepared. She was observing. And when the media's CEO, Victor Hammond, took the stand and casually dismissed their editing of Karoline's press conference comments, as routine reporting, Karoline struck. She calmly stood, reached into her bag, and pulled out a small, gold-plated audio recorder. "Your Honor," she said, her voice now steady and commanding with the court's permission, "I'd like to play a recording." The room fell silent. The judge, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone, gave a nod. The audio played. It was a clear, unedited clip of Karoline's original press conference remarks, measured, respectful, and focused on policy. Then Karoline played the clip that aired on Global News Bureau's evening segment. The same words, but twisted, cut, and rearranged to make her appear dismissive and even inflammatory. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Then came emails, internal memos, testimony from a whistleblower within the media company, a senior editor who had resigned in protest. All of it meticulously prepared by Karoline herself. Judge Holloway leaned forward in her chair, visibly shaken. This wasn't a publicity stunt. This was a legal takedown, conducted by someone who had taught herself the law in the quiet corners of the White House library, burning the midnight oil, while others slept. The next day, the judge didn't just dismiss the defamation case. She issued a rare media restriction, barring Global News Bureau from covering Karoline or the administration for 3 years due to willful defamation. It was the first time in over a decade such a penalty had been imposed. Reporters raced to cover the story. But for Karoline, this wasn't about headlines. "This is about truth," she said calmly to the press outside the courthouse. "Not just mine, but yours and every American's." That night, Judge Holloway did something few had ever seen from the bench. She apologized. "I misjudged her," the judge admitted, her voice heavy with reflection. "She presented a case more skillfully than many seasoned attorneys I've seen. And she did it not to win applause, but to uphold justice." Karoline accepted the apology with grace and humility. And in a surprising turn, she offered the judge something else, an invitation. 3 weeks later, Holloway joined Karoline at the White House not as a judge, but as a senior advisor on media transparency and judicial reform. 2 women, once on opposite sides of the courtroom, now stood side by side in the fight for truth. For those watching from home, especially Americans who grew up in a time when honesty was expected and public service meant integrity, Karoline's story resonated deeply. She reminded many that standing up for what's right doesn't require age or a title, just courage, preparation, and faith. And perhaps that's why so many have now framed her journey not as a political act, but a patriotic one. After stunning the country by dismantling a defamation lawsuit from a major media company, armed with nothing but the First Amendment, a box of evidence, and her own legal savvy, Karoline Leavitt. The 27-year-old White House press secretary thought the courtroom chapter of her journey had finally ended. But Washington, D.C. had other plans. Only 3 weeks had passed since the verdict that shook the media world. Judge Holloway had retired from the bench and was now working beside Karoline as a senior advisor on media integrity. Public trust in the justice system was seeing a small but hopeful rebound. Americans, especially older generations who had lived through Watergate, the Clinton hearings, and the Patriot Act, felt that for once the system had held the powerful accountable. Then came a new summons. This time it wasn't Karoline on trial. It was Captain Richard Langston, a 68-year-old retired Navy officer who had filed a federal complaint after being removed from a veterans event in Virginia. His offense, publicly defending Karoline during a local speech while wearing his military uniform and a cross lapel pin. Langston had served 2 tours in Vietnam and another in the Gulf. For nearly 5 decades he had stood for American values, freedom, discipline, and honor. So, when event organizers accused him of political expression and ejected him from the hall, he refused to stay quiet. Karoline heard about it the same day. The footage was jarring: an older man in a crisp navy blazer, calmly explaining his right to speak, being escorted out by 2 uniformed security guards. The American flag just feet away. It hit her like a gut punch. "This isn't about me anymore," she said that night to Judge Holloway. "This is about every man and woman who ever wore that uniform." When Langston's case landed in court, Karoline showed up not as a defendant or even an observer this time, but as an ally. She sat behind him in the gallery, quietly offering her presence as a form of solidarity. Reporters, recognizing her, instantly began snapping photos. But Karoline wasn't there for the cameras. She was there because this time the system had picked the wrong veteran to silence. The judge, Kenneth Marshall, a younger appointee with less than 5 years on the bench, opened the session with barely disguised skepticism. "Captain Langston," he said flatly, "this courtroom is not a place for personal crusades." Langston stood calmly, his medals glinting faintly under the overhead lights. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady as oak, "I'm not on a crusade. I'm here because I was told I couldn't stand up for truth in uniform." Karoline watched the exchange with clenched hands. This was all too familiar. Another courtroom, another moment where principles met power and power seemed to win. Then something unexpected happened. Langston opened a small leather folder and pulled out a letter handwritten in 1985 from Ronald Reagan, thanking him for his service after Operation Urgent Fury. He had kept it folded between his discharge papers for nearly 40 years. "I wore the same pin that day," he told the court, holding up the cross on his blazer. "And no one questioned my patriotism then. But now I'm told my faith makes me dangerous." The courtroom went still. Even Judge Marshall, usually composed, shifted uncomfortably. Karoline knew it was time. She quietly passed a small envelope to Langston's attorney. Inside were documents gathered over the past 2 weeks, witness statements, social media footage, and email leaks revealing that the event organizers had been pressured by an outside political group to silence faith-aligned veterans. The documents were entered into evidence. A gasp rippled through the room as Judge Marshall flipped through the pages. The truth was plain. Captain Langston had been targeted not because he violated protocol, but because he voiced support for someone the political machine didn't like. Karoline never spoke that day, not once, but her presence alone seemed to amplify the courtroom's gravity. By mid-afternoon, the tide had turned. Judge Marshall, now visibly shaken by the written evidence, offered a rare bench statement. "It is not the role of this court to decide whose speech is acceptable when expressed peacefully and within the law. Captain Langston's actions were within his rights. This case should never have reached my docket. He dismissed the charges. The gallery applauded. As Captain Langston turned to leave, he paused by Karoline's seat. He didn't salute. He simply nodded and said, "Thank you, ma'am, for standing when others stayed seated." Later that evening, Fox News ran the headline, "Veteran Defends, Leavitt Wins. In Court Sparks New Debate on Free Speech." On X, the hashtag Cross in Uniform began trending. Karoline's phone lit up with calls from senators, veterans groups, even old high school teachers. But it wasn't the noise she focused on. It was the quiet moment that came after. Sitting in her office late that night, she added a second item to the small shelf above her desk, right next to the framed $500 contempt of court receipt. A photograph of her and Captain Langston walking out of the courthouse side by side. Because symbols matter. And now that shelf didn't just represent her own fight. It represented the fight of every American, especially those who'd served for a country where speech is free. Faith is respected, and justice is not just blind, but fair. By the time Karoline Leavitt returned to her White House office, the quiet hum of the Capitol couldn't drown out the storm she had just unleashed. The silver cross still resting delicately on her navy blazer wasn't just an accessory anymore. It had become a symbol, a beacon of faith, freedom, and resistance against overreach. She didn't just win a case in court. She ignited something bigger than she could have imagined. But for Karoline, the $500 fine framed on her wall wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a greater fight. 3 days after Judge Charles Hargrove's suspension and resignation, Karoline sat at her desk, her inbox flooded with thousands of messages. Veterans, pastors, students, and small-town mayors across the country wrote in. One letter from a 79-year-old Vietnam vet in Mississippi read, "I wore a cross around my neck for decades while serving this nation. A judge tried to shame you for that same symbol. But you stood tall, Miss Karoline. You gave us back our voice." That same evening, Karoline met with President Trump in the West Wing. His voice was grave but filled with admiration. "Karoline, what you did in that courtroom, it wasn't just bold, it was transformational. We need to build on this. Take that fire and turn it into something even bigger." And so she did. Within 72 hours, Karoline assembled a legal and communications team inside the White House, focused on religious freedom and civil liberties. It was informally named the Liberty Initiative. But this wasn't just about courtrooms or hashtags. It was about the heart of America, protecting faith in public life, ensuring fairness in our justice system, and giving everyday citizens the courage to speak up when things didn't feel right. Her first major mission, reform the dress code and contempt policies in local and municipal courts nationwide. After digging into years of data, some of which had been quietly collected by brave clerks like Mrs. Thompson from D.C., Karoline's team discovered a disturbing pattern. Across dozens of jurisdictions, judges had fined citizens disproportionately for wearing religious symbols while ignoring other far more disruptive attire. "We're not talking about a few isolated cases," Karoline said at a briefing. "We're talking about a cultural bias being hidden behind a black robe." The Liberty Initiative released a detailed report titled "Bias in Plain Sight," and the findings were sobering. In one Midwest city, citizens were fined for crosses or hijabs 7 times more frequently than for profane T-shirts or large political buttons. The American public responded with righteous indignation. Church groups held candlelight vigils. Veterans organizations demanded accountability. A wave of momentum began to swell, not political, but deeply moral. As the momentum built, Karoline did something few in Washington dared. She brought Judge Hargrove into the conversation. It wasn't a media stunt. It wasn't about forgiveness alone. It was about showing America that transformation is possible. In a televised panel aired on national TV, Hargrove appeared alongside Karoline and admitted his failure. "I thought I was applying the law neutrally," he said, his voice low and reflective. "But neutrality without awareness is its own form of prejudice." Miss Leavitt opened my eyes. And now I want to help others open theirs. That moment sent shockwaves across the country. Americans of all ages, especially seniors, saw something familiar in that courtroom drama, something personal. Many had been through battles of their own in quieter ways. They remembered times when prayer was forbidden in public schools, when veterans were shunned for speaking out, or when standing up for what's right meant risking everything. Karoline's stance reminded them of those moments and gave them hope. Soon, Karoline was invited to speak at the National Prayer Breakfast. Wearing that same silver cross on her blazer, she took the stage and spoke not just as a press secretary, but as an American daughter, raised by faith, guided by conscience, and shaped by the Constitution. "The fine I was given was $500, she said to a crowd of lawmakers, military leaders, and religious figures. But the cost of staying silent would have been far greater. What's at stake isn't money. It's whether truth still matters in this country." That speech aired across every major network, and something remarkable happened. Donations poured in, not for Karoline, but for the Liberty Initiative's outreach arm, which provided legal advice and support for those unfairly penalized for their faith or beliefs. Within 2 weeks, they'd raised over $3 million. But Karoline wasn't finished. She introduced the Justice and Fairness in Courtrooms Act, a bipartisan bill requiring courts to clearly post dress code standards, define contempt charges transparently, and prohibit judges from arbitrarily penalizing religious expressions unless it genuinely disrupts proceedings. Her testimony before Congress was aired live. "We don't need to agree on theology," she said, "but we should all agree on freedom." Behind her sat Mrs. Thompson, now director of a new National Judicial Integrity Task Force. James Wilson, the veteran bailiff, served as the group's ethics advisor. And even Judge Hargrove, once the antagonist of this tale, had become its unexpected ally, reviewing court training materials with a new lens of humility and wisdom. By the end of the month, courts in 14 states had updated their policies. And across social media, the hashtag #CrossInCourt was still trending, not as a protest anymore, but as a symbol of victory, of unity, and of unwavering courage. Back in her office one late evening, Karoline sat alone, the city lights twinkling through the window. She looked once more at the framed $500 fine, a relic of a judge's mistake, but also the spark that had lit a national reckoning. And somewhere in the quiet of that night, she smiled, not for herself, but for every American who'd ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, or hide who they were. Because thanks to that one fine, they never would again. It was just past 7:30 a.m. when Karoline Leavitt sat alone at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. Outside her White House residence window, the early light bathed Washington in a soft, orange glow. The silver cross still pinned to her blazer had, over the past few weeks, gone from a simple expression of faith to a national symbol of truth and courage. The framed receipt for her $500 contempt fine still sat proudly on the shelf. A memento of the day, everything began to shift. Just as she finished reading the last line of a memo on upcoming legal reforms, her private line rang. Only 2 people had that number, President Trump and her husband. But the voice that came through the speaker wasn't either of them. "Miss Leavitt, this is Sister Eleanor Matthews," said the elderly voice, gentle but clear. "I'm sorry to call you so early, but we need your help." Karoline paused, surprised. Sister Eleanor, a retired nun in her late 70s, had served as principal of a Catholic school in Virginia for over 40 years. She was also a beloved figure in her community, was modest, and never one to stir public waves. If she was calling, something serious was happening. "Of course," Sister Karoline replied warmly. "What's going on?" There was a brief silence, then a shaky breath. "Yesterday, a state official showed up at our school. Told us we'd have to remove all religious imagery from classrooms, the crosses, the Bible verses on the wall, even our morning prayer. Said it violated the new Neutral Learning Spaces guideline passed last week." Karoline's heart clenched. "They're trying to strip religious identity from a private faith-based school." "Yes," Sister Eleanor confirmed, her voice tightening. "And they gave us 72 hours to comply." A slow, burning anger welled up in Karoline's chest, the same kind she'd felt when Judge Hargrove tried to shame her over her cross. But alongside that anger was a spark of excitement. This wasn't just a legal battle, this was a chance to protect generations of children from quietly losing their rights. "I'll be there this afternoon," she said, already reaching for her notebook. "And I won't be coming alone." By noon, Karoline had assembled her response team. Emily Harper, her trusted media aide, pulled together data news clips and legal documents. Former Judge Margaret Holloway, now director of the White House's Judicial Accountability and Reform Task Force, agreed to accompany her. And from the Office of Legal Policy, 2 young attorneys volunteered to help prepare a legal response, both eager to stand beside Karoline in the fight. The team arrived at St. Margaret's School in the small Virginia town of Hawthorne by 3:00 p.m. The old brick building, with its wooden pews and modest classrooms, looked like a Norman Rockwell painting come to life. Parents and teachers had gathered, many looking anxious. When Karoline stepped out of the SUV, a round of spontaneous applause broke out, not because of her title, but because they knew someone was finally standing up for them. Sister Eleanor met her at the entrance. Her silver hair framed her soft face, but her eyes were sharp. "Thank you for coming, Karoline." Karoline shook her hand firmly. "We're not letting them take this from you." Inside the modest school library, the team reviewed the new state regulation. It cited vague wording about non-secular instructional decor, and while it wasn't a law, it gave local education officials latitude to enforce it however they chose. "This isn't about neutrality," Holloway said bluntly, flipping through the packet. "It's quiet coercion. They hope fear will do their work for them." As the sun dipped behind the tall pine trees, Karoline called a press conference right on the school's front lawn. Microphones were set up quickly. American flags flanked the podium. Families, teachers, and local journalists gathered. Karoline spoke with measured passion, her words deliberate, every syllable striking at the heart of what mattered. "This school has educated children in faith and values for over 60 years. Today, bureaucrats want to erase that heritage one cross at a time. But faith isn't noise, it's foundation. And in America, we don't rip that away from children in the name of political trends." A cheer rose from the crowd, some with tears in their eyes. "We're filing an immediate injunction against this enforcement," Karoline continued, lifting a folder. "And if we need to take it all the way to the Supreme Court, we will." That night, on every conservative news outlet, the clip aired Karoline Leavitt standing tall in front of a red brick schoolhouse, holding the line for religious freedom. Hashtags like #FaithInSchool and #StandWithSister Eleanor exploded across social media. Seniors across the country called into local radio shows, sharing stories of their own school prayers now long gone. Some even wrote handwritten letters to Karoline's office. Back at the White House, Trump called just before midnight. "You did it again, Karoline. The people see it. They feel it. You're not just defending religion. You're defending the soul of America." She thanked him, her eyes glancing toward the window where the soft moonlight cast the shadow of the cross pinned to her collar across the wall. The fight wasn't over. But tonight, America had remembered what it stood for. The sun had barely risen over Washington, D.C., when Karoline Leavitt unlocked her office door at the White House. The morning air was crisp, and the scent of fresh coffee from the West Wing kitchen lingered in the hallways. She had barely set down her leather handbag when Emily Harper, her trusted assistant, burst in holding a thick yellow envelope with a Kansas return address. "Not marked official, but I think you'll want to see this," Emily said, handing it over with a curious look. Karoline slid it open with a letter opener she kept from her first week on the job, engraved with the date she became the youngest White House press secretary in history. Inside was a neatly folded handwritten letter and a photograph. The photo showed a simple white church, its wooden steeple bent slightly with age standing proud against the flat Kansas plains. The letter was from Pastor William Jensen, 82 years old, from Abilene, Kansas. "Dear Miss Leavitt, I've pastored this small church for nearly 5 decades. In that time, I've seen the country change in ways I never imagined. But last week, a state inspector came by our food pantry and told us we couldn't hand out Bibles with our meals anymore. Said it violated non-denominational distribution laws or some such nonsense. I've fed the hungry in God's name since 1975. Never once has a person refused a sandwich because there was scripture inside. I saw your fight for that school in Virginia, and I thought maybe, just maybe, someone in Washington still hears us. So I'm asking, can you help? Before it's too late." Karoline read the letter twice, her throat tightening. This wasn't just another headline or social media trend. This was the heart of America calling. It was the voice of a quiet patriot who had fed the poor, preached the gospel, and now feared losing the very freedoms he'd taken for granted his whole life. She picked up the photo again. The paint on the church door was chipped, the grass around it overgrown. But the cross above the entrance still stood firm, just like Pastor Jensen. "We're going to Kansas," Karoline said, her voice firm. Emily blinked. "Today, this weekend, quiet visit. No press, not yet. This isn't a photo op, it's a promise." By Sunday morning, Karoline arrived at Abilene's tiny airport in a modest government vehicle, wearing jeans, a flannel coat, and her familiar cross-shaped pin. The town of just over 6,000 people welcomed her like a long-lost neighbor. Pastor Jensen greeted her at the church steps with watery eyes and a firm handshake. Inside, she met volunteers packing paper bags with canned goods, bread, and homemade soup. Bibles sat quietly on a side table as they had for decades. No pressure, no preaching, just an offer. After hearing the full story, Karoline sat with Pastor Jensen and his team and laid out a plan, not just to respond legally, but to bring attention to the quiet erosion of faith-based charity. She would propose a new federal protection, the Community Faith Freedom Act, guaranteeing faith-based outreach programs the right to operate freely without penalty, so long as participation remained voluntary. "I don't want fame," Miss Leavitt, Jensen said softly. "I just want to keep doing God's work without fear." Karoline placed her hand over his. "Then we'll make sure you can for as long as you choose." As she left the church that afternoon, families lined the sidewalk waving gently. Some held signs that read, "God bless you. Karoline and faith feeds the soul." Back in Washington, her team got to work drafting legislation, reaching out to bipartisan leaders, and gathering data on other incidents just like Pastor Jensen's. Because this wasn't just about one small Kansas town. It was about protecting the American spirit, quiet, generous, and full of faith.